From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. When you ask people what stands between them and a more positive outlook on the world, at or near the top of that list is invariably the media. Many of us feel overwhelmed by all that's happening in the world, and while yes, of course, there's plenty to be concerned about, our guest today believes that we'd all feel better and would be more likely to stay engaged to address some of these problems if news organizations and social media influencers spent more time describing the many solutions to these challenges that are being practiced all over the world. David Bornstein is the co-founder and CEO of the Solutions Journalism Network. He comes to this role after having been a journalist himself, focusing primarily on social innovation for 3 decades. From 2010 to 2021, he co-authored the Fixes column in the New York Times, which examined efforts to respond to major social problems. He also wrote the books The Price of a Dream, The Story of the Grameen Bank, Social Entrepreneurship, What Everyone Needs to Know, and How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas. I really enjoyed speaking with David. I'm a huge fan of what he's doing, and I'm guessing that by the end of this Blue Sky conversation, you will be too. David Bornstein, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Bill.
I'm really inspired by your work, and I'd love to start with, I saw on your website how you describe what your mission is, and it's transforming news is critical to building a more equitable and sustainable world. And you say the Solutions Journalism Network is leading a global shift in journalism focused on what the news misses most often, how people are trying to solve problems, and what we can learn from their successes or failures. I'd love to start with, you have a background in writing, but also in social entrepreneurship. And there are a lot of different ways you could be spending your time and energy. Why solutions journalism?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think that, I've seen, after having written about social entrepreneurship and really essentially people trying to solve problems for much of the past 30 years, one of the things that really hits me over and over is that it's a kind of hidden history. That there's all of this effort all around the world and all of this people trying to reduce suffering, people trying to fix systems, repair things. It's basically it's the biggest untold story in the world today. And when people don't hear about these stories, they assume that other people are worse than they are. They assume that the world is far meaner than it really is, frankly. And that causes them to live their lives according to that belief, which means that people circumscribe their emotion. They become very fearful. They vote in ways that are very defensive, and so the sort of the fear-based narratives and the anxiety and the belief that other people are just not very decent is something that journalism creates. And the problem with that is that it's self-fulfilling. If you actually believe those things, you will act accordingly, and you won't let your best, the better angels of your nature will not come through. So in the end, the question is like, what does the news do to people? Does it feed their capacity to love, to care, to connect, to build something better? Or does it cause them to circle the wagons and keep outsiders out and build a wall, or whatever the metaphor is? And we see that these narratives are man-made, but they lead to they can lead to very, very dangerous real-world outcomes.
And it seems also, in addition to circling the wagons, another bad outcome can be just despair and just, there's nothing I can do about it. The world's going to hell.
Yeah.
Climate change is going to end Earth as we know it in 30 years, so why bother? And that's as dangerous, right? When people just don't take any action because they think it's hopeless.
That's right, yeah. And it's interesting that you're saying that. It's such a profound point because, in journalism, there's this sense that what people need is information, right? Like we need to, quote unquote, inform people. And the most important thing we need to inform them about is about how bad everything is and how horrible and urgent
Right.
and dangerous and unjust the world is, because the idea is, sort of the theory of change is that when people understand how terrible everything is, then those things will change. And you kind of just know that that's not true. Anyone who's ever had children knows that you can't just point out what they do wrong every day. You also have to show them the possibilities to do the things that bring them joy and fulfillment and connection. And so, managing people's energy and their hope and their sense of agency turns out to be really important if you actually want to engage people and have them involved in, building a better community or a better society. And so those emotional, or even you could think of it as energy is a real thing. It's like people don't have energy.
Right.
They don't do anything. And optimism and energy go together.
I interviewed Marcy Frank, who works at the Harvard Chan School, writes the Climate Optimist newsletter. And she's made an interesting point, which was we went for years with climate denial from a lot of people, which leads to inaction. And now we've gone to climate doom with a lot of people, which also leads to inaction. and she claims they even have some evidence to suggest that the fossil fuel companies, or the vested interests in perpetuating the old way of doing things, are now pushing. They used to push denialism. Now they're pushing doomism and sort of saying, there's nothing we can do about this. So have you seen that as well?
I have heard that. I haven't actually seen the studies around that. Yeah, absolutely. It totally makes sense. And the sort of apocalyptic framing, it's very useful for people who actually don't want to create political movements and don't want to actually empower people to stand up. I mean, look at ExxonMobil. They just spent, $60 billion, buying, new sources of energy, new fossil fuel sources of energy. Really, with at the same time that the climate scientists are saying, they're using this, saying that there is mind-boggling heat increases in the world that are way beyond what they even expected,
right?
Just in the past couple of years. So you have these two things going on,
right?
And if, in order to keep people asleep at the wheel of their democracy or at the world, you need to shut that down. And so that makes total sense. And the sad thing is that, or the sad inadvertent thing is that journalism, and almost without fail, most journalists I know really, really, really want to be helpful. Their job, they want to actually be giving people information that will help create a just, equitable, sustainable world, and so forth. It's just the lack of awareness of human behavioral psychology, or the lack of consideration that we're not like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. You need to communicate to people in ways that engage them, that help them to see, their options, and that they have better options, is a really, really important, simple thing. I mean, the economist Amartya Sen, has written about the fact that a lot of development work, or a lot of the progress in development work, boils down to giving people better options, giving women better options, giving people better economic options, and so forth. There are almost always, better options for your community, for your family, for your company, for your policy choices, and helping people see those options and see the pathways. And so constantly surfacing, the ideas around the world that are emerging at any point in time that help us see new possibilities turns out to be really, really important.
Yeah.
For advancing positive social change.
I'd like to dig into that a little bit, because one of the reasons I appreciate what you all do is when I tell people what I'm working on, a lot of times they just assume, oh, those are good news stories. The neighbor gets the cat down from the tree, or there's this beautiful reunion at the airport, which are great. But I think traditionally a lot of news outlets, they've sort of tacked that on to the end of the nightly news, this little feel-good story. Your work, as I understand it, though, is looking at really tough, hard challenges like climate change, like homelessness. You pick your challenge, but you encourage stories about solutions to those tough challenges. Is that a good way to describe it? It's a difference.
Yeah, very much. And we don't consider solutions journalism to be, quote, positive news or good news or feel good. In fact, we often look for, and when we train news organizations, we use this phrase, positive deviance. The idea that if you look at 100 people trying to solve a particular problem, how do we help our farmers when our summers are getting hotter or wetter or drier? How do we help our elders when we're going to have 30 days each summer that are going to be over 100 degrees, and many people in certain communities don't have transportation or air conditioning or things to be able to deal with that? How do we help our teens who are suffering from mental health issues at a very high rate? So the question is, what are our options to do better? So if you look at a bunch of communities across the country and you point out, well, there's a small number of them that are doing much, much smarter things. So one, you report on the idea, you're able to show, here's a better option. You go inside the black box and you say, here's how they're getting these better results. So you're giving people knowledge. But you're also saying most places aren't doing this. Only 5% of the places that could be doing this are doing it. Is that good news? No, that's a story of dramatic underperformance. That's telling people we could be doing a lot better. So it's not like you walk away saying the problem is solved, I can go to sleep now, or I can go eat, go watch Netflix. You walk away with a challenge like, wow, we could be doing so much better. We have better methods. We have better ideas out there. And it creates kind of FOMO. In other words, like, why is this community doing something smart to protect their teens and our people aren't doing that? Why, that you want to get people energized, in some cases outraged, but but not fatalistic. So if you create outrage and energy, but you also give people ideas and options, then you get change. And that's basically what solutions journalism is all about.
It's funny because it popped in my head when you were describing these outliers. Netflix has a series out, it's been out for a little while now, called on the Blue Zones, where this gentleman goes around the world and finds these little pockets where people have this outrageous percentage of centenarians.
Yeah.
And then he says, why? And he digs in, and it's, well, they eat better, they walk a lot, they exercise without knowing they're exercising, they have social communities, they do this, that, and the other. And I'm at that age where people are talking about longevity and stuff. People are all abuzz about it. And I think it's because there's a solution, and it's not a pill. It's these basic, back to basics things that is just so refreshing to hear. I think people are responding to it.
Yeah, very much. And some of the organizations that are working around mental health issues in, say, for example, in Africa, where you have many communities that don't have health professionals or mental health professionals. Some communities don't have any psychologists or psychiatrists or social workers, and yet they have depression, they have anxiety, they have all these issues. And they come up with community-based responses that are actually very effective. Because what these things often boil down to, it has to do with, we need more connection to people. We need to improve our social relationships. We need deeper connection in some cases to nature, or to purpose, or to ourselves. What happens out of these, and there's one I'm thinking of called Strong Minds, which my colleague Tina Rosenberg wrote about in our column in the New York Times, fixes that we used to write. They have very good evidence of really improving, mental health outcomes, and they do it in this community-based format. Now, this could work in any rural community in the United States, and it's not expensive compared to $150 an hour therapy sessions or what the other option is.
I like how David Bornstein describes social entrepreneurship and the tremendous effort being placed on solving global problems as our biggest untold story. This belief fuels our efforts at the Optimism Institute, and it's encouraging to hear someone with David's background and experience reinforcing this notion. Of course, I also really like it when he says that optimism and energy go together, and that journalists can encourage this energy by reporting not just on problems, but also on solutions. As he says, we can be outraged about the problems of the world, but it doesn't do any good to be fatalistic. Turning back to our conversation, I asked David to speak about how his organization trains journalists to do the work he espouses.
We've been around for 10 years. For the first 5 years, I would say we were really softening up the field to acknowledge that solutions journalism is legitimate, that it's not feel good, it's not fluffy, it's not advocacy. So that took quite a while to get that across. And we did it by creating projects with really credible news organizations, with hard-nosed investigative journalists, showing that you could do rigorous reporting on how people are solving problems, and that this produced great journalists. And a lot of great journalism was produced. A lot of it won awards and things like that. And that helped shift people's beliefs around the legitimization of this. So in the last 5 years, we've really focused on scaling the practice around the world. How do you, now that people accept the idea that it's legitimate, how do you actually get it into the workflows, into the editorial decision making in news organizations around the globe? And so what we have really good training programs that we work with, where we have news organizations often in cohorts, training them around what good solutions journalism is, learning from each other, we have a database with 15,000 stories in it. You can look at what great stories are, many different languages. We have fellows and train the trainers now in more than 40 countries. These are people who've been trained in how do you do a solutions journalism training for a news organization. And so they're people stationed around, not stationed, but living around the world where they can actually bring solutions journalism into their news organizations in their communities in a way that's very culturally relevant and in the language that is culturally relevant. And we also have partnerships with other training organizations around the world where we do a sort of handoff to them. We say, this is what we've learned from training solutions journalism, and we sort of pass it over to them so that they can be the local solutions journalism hub in their region. We have 2 partners in Africa, 2 partners in Europe, 1 in Canada, and that is growing too. So really, there's a training component, and then there's giving people lots of examples, showing them what good journalism looks like, so that they can learn from the stories. And now increasingly, what we're doing is we're trying to help people learn from the solutions that come from the solutions journalism. So in addition to changing the behavior of news organizations, which is happening very rapidly, for example, CBS News just adopted the solutions journalism approach in all of its owned and operated stations in the United States, which is 14 major markets. We have many news organizations that have done that. They see that it deals with news avoidance, which is a big problem. It gets good engagement. It helps people feel better in terms of their sense of agency, the fact that there are things that can be done, which makes people feel that there's a what can we do response to the story, which is very important for people. So now the idea is like, oh, if we see, hundreds of solutions journalism stories coming out of, rural communities in the United States about how people are adapting to changes in agriculture because of the change in climate, you can actually use AI now to look at those stories and say, what are the patterns? What are the strategic insights that are coming out of it? And how do we help people learn from each other much more quickly? Because the positive deviants are basically people who are doing something smarter earlier. That's pretty much what the thing is. So how does everyone get that message quicker than just the normal, slow way that it would happen by happenstance?
I imagine too, and it'd be a side benefit, it wouldn't necessarily be the reason you do this. I imagine the journalists themselves enjoy this. They feel better writing a story about a solution than just focusing on the problem and filing the story.
We have found, and this is especially strong with younger journalists, 100%. Older journalists are still like, my job is to catch bad guys, a lot of them. And that's fair. I mean, there's a lot of bad guys to catch.
That's still important.
Yeah,
that's still important.
You still have to hold people accountable for inhibiting the bad things that they're doing. But it's kind of like the body. Like, they used to say sunlight is the best disinfectant, is a sort of an idea in journalism. And that's basically an argument for we need to be antibiotics.
Right.
So our job is to kill the germs when there are germs.
Sure.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Penicillin is very good. But most of the year, you're not on antibiotics. Most of the year, you're strengthening your immune system by eating your fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. You're eating the Mediterranean, you're eating the blue region diet.
Exactly.
That's what you're doing to stay healthy. And so what a lot of younger journalists are seeing is like, wow, we can actually strengthen accountability. We can help our communities deal with their problems by also surfacing these models and ideas that they could be adapting or learning from. And so when they do that, you hear a lot of young journalists saying, this makes me feel more like I'm really helping my community. And most journalists, once again, that's their value. They went in to be helpful. So actually, this is not a problem for people. And also there's more of a sense of meaning, when they're able to go into, a school, for example, and report on the school and how the school is trying to deal with some student issue, maybe how they're trying to increase the graduation rate, or how they're trying to deal with the fact that more and more, many of the students in the school may have experienced childhood trauma or something. These are real issues. They find that the schools are more likely to share information with them and tell them, well, this is what we've tried, this worked, this didn't, and just have a more honest dialogue, because there's not this incredible defensiveness thinking that these journalists only want to come in and pounce on me and expose everything wrong that I'm doing. Now that is legitimate when there's something wrong that you're doing, but lots of times failure is just we tried something and it didn't work. It's not like we're really bad people. We haven't figured this out yet. And journalists need a language to deal with problem solving. That's true for how hard problem solving is. It's kind of like Thomas Edison once said, apparently, I didn't fail, I just found 500 ways it won't work, So we need to be able to cover people who are trying things that are difficult and look at, the problem-solving process in a much more respectful way, and not just sort of, come in and say the school was a failure and the principal should be fired, which is this kind of the old model of gotcha journalism.
I used to work with a great optimist, Ted Turner, and he used to say from his sailing career, he lost all the time when he started out. He said, "I'm not losing, I'm just learning how to win." And that was his spin. So let me play, not necessarily devil's advocate, but I would imagine as you approach some of these organizations, for the most part, they're still for-profit businesses. There are some nonprofits in journalism, although they still need to generate revenue and that sort of thing. And the conventional wisdom is if it bleeds, it leads. And if we do nothing but this feel-good stuff that these guys are promoting, the business is going to go to hell. And I'm sure you have that pushback, or I imagine you do. How do you respond to that?
Well, we just, we talk about places like CBS News. CBS News did a lot of research before they did this. It's not...
They don't mess around.
They don't mess around. They know ratings and they can track it pretty well. They're seeing that the engagement in news is dropping, and it has been dropping consistently. The Reuters Institute has been tracking what's called news avoidance at a global level for quite a number of years now. And the data shows that people more and more are just overwhelmed by the negativity of the news. So the answer is not to come in and give people positive things and say, oh, here's the happy story at the end of the day. The answer, ultimately, what people need more than anything is news that they can engage with. If you care about, if you're a meditator, for example, you are interested in reading. You probably spend a lot of time listening to podcasts about meditation. You're interested in learning. I want to learn more about this. If you're a sailor like Ted Turner, then you're probably reading sailing magazines to try to understand how to be a better sailor or whatever. People want information that helps them to be more powerful towards the things they care about. So it just totally makes sense that when the journalism becomes knowledge-based, when it's helping people achieve their goals in their family, their communities, their companies, their society, people will engage. And so much of the stuff that we've seen around solutions journalism is that people do engage with it. They like it. They prefer it. No less than it's absolutely 100% true that when there are outrageous things happening in the world, whether it's climate change or war or something, people, the amygdala, the old biological reflexes to sort of check the news every 2 minutes. That's 100% true. We are wired to pay attention to threatening things. That's true. That's just why humans stayed alive. They paid attention to threatening things. But we are also wired to pay attention to things that make us feel more powerful. And that's not good news. That's not the cat in the tree story. That's stories that are based on methods. This is how a community can go from having no Main Street and all the young people want to leave to being a community that has a great Main Street that's thriving and the young people want to come back and live there. A problem that many, many small towns in the United States are facing. If you can tell that story, there's thousands of places that say, we want to read that story. We absolutely want to read. We want to study that story, actually. So that's why you can move it, the data around news avoidance and the fact that news organizations know that people are overwhelmed by what they're currently giving them. It's like a restaurant where people are saying, I don't like the food. And the proprietor is saying, well, why don't you come more often? You're like, I don't like the food. So without betraying any journalistic ethics, make the news more, fortify it with information that really meets people's information needs and helps them to be more effective in the things that they want to be effective in. It's totally doable.
David describes that the first job of the Solutions Journalism Network was simply to convince journalists to accept and embrace this concept. Once that was successful, as they began to train news people on how to do this work well, they started sharing examples of effective execution of this practice. In the process of evangelizing and training, they quickly found that the journalists themselves enjoy doing this kind of work. From my more limited experience, I've found that David is correct when he says that journalists generally want to do the right thing and they want to help people while they inform them. And it's not surprising to hear him say that young people in the profession are responding particularly well to this way of doing their job. And I was struck by this concept of news avoidance. We tend to take it for granted that bad news attracts eyeballs, but perhaps we finally reached a point where consumers are saying enough already and are staying away. CBS owned and operated stations work in intensely competitive markets, and their embrace of this work tells you a lot about the effectiveness of keeping people engaged in the news by delivering more encouraging stories. To this point, getting back to our conversation, I wanted to talk about ways that today we can measure better than ever before precisely which stories appeal to news consumers and which ones don't. So you mentioned CBS News, and I'm thinking about, the history of television, radio for that matter, was, ratings, and you could even do, quarter hour or 5-minute segments. You could sort of get a sense for what people are attracted to. In traditional newspaper business, you knew your circulation and paid subscribers and that sort of thing, but you had no idea how much time they were spending in the sports section versus the arts section, whatever. But now, with more people consuming news digitally, you can measure that. And I read the New York Times online, and they have the most read section. I can see what stories are the most popular. And I'm probably biased, but I feel like a lot of them are pretty positive and pretty solutions oriented. Are you seeing that kind of research and hopefully some reinforcement of the work you're doing to push back on the publishers and the shareholders or whoever and say, no, this is actually working. This is not only a good thing to do, but it's good for your business?
Very much. There is a real sense in the field, and that's why our work has spread a lot, that solutions journalism engages people well. It doesn't always engage people more than the very outrageous negative news, and one wouldn't expect it to because of the way people are drawn. But the fact that it often does better, it is certainly competitive. That in itself tells you that there's a huge upside, because you can make an argument to a community. And you mentioned that many news organizations are nonprofit, right? Increasingly, news organizations, especially at the local level in the United States, need to get their revenues from the community. And that means memberships, sponsorships, perhaps foundation grants from community foundations, asking people to subscribe. If you want to basically say, we want to bring you back, we want you to actually pay for the food at our restaurant, the people are going to say, it better taste good. It better be something that I need in my life, because I have a very crowded life. I'm busy. There's 5 million Netflix channels and Amazon Prime channels, and I have feeds from social media, and I have Instagram Reels, and I have TikTok. I have all of these things that are very, very, being designed with with these incredible algorithms to sort of capture my attention. Why should I pay attention to your news source? What is it going to do for me other than make me feel scared and anxious? And the answer to that is, it's going to show you how our community can become better. It's going to show, one of the New York Times last year, one of the top stories of the year and the most widely shared stories on Instagram, according to what they told us, of all time, was a story about how Houston had found housing for 25,000 people.
Yes.
And this story was incredibly popular.
Yeah. And
the editors, Michael Kilman and Matt Thompson, who worked on that section of the New York Times called Headway, they were telling us this was incredibly widely distributed. We saw that when we were writing our column, Tina Rosenberg and I at the Times, which is called Fixes. We would do stories on child trauma and homelessness and foster care
tough
system.
stuff.
All of these things that almost never get much attention. And consistently, those stories were on the most emailed list, which is the list that the Times used to keep years ago, where you could see how things were being shared through email. Now, of course, it's a lot more social media. Yeah, there's not really a business argument against solutions journalism. The business argument is very much in line with it. And now, as we move more into an AI world, it's more likely that the news is going to become driven by queries more often than just, here's what we're giving you, take it or leave it. People will be able to go in and say, please show me stories about, how, whatever their question is. We have a mental health problem in our community. Show me stories that are useful to us, that can help us. So once you give more power to the audience to request what they want when they come into the restaurant, please cook this dish for me, you are going to get people naturally saying, please send me news that will help us, that will help me. They're not going to say, please send me the 101th article about how terrible this problem is or this problem is. People would never request that, So that shift of power is going to be it's a business opportunity. It's obviously an ethical opportunity as well in terms of really meeting people's needs.
The Houston homelessness is a great example. I remember that story, and I think it's also led to more reporting on that progress that they've made in Houston, right? And one of the reasons I love that example is there's nothing more sort of in our face today and seemingly solutionless for a lot of people is the homeless crisis. So the fact that you could write about something that is so in our face and so unsettling and feel so hopeless and then have it passed all over the world just tells you everything you need to know. One of the things, speaking of passing around, one of the things you've hinted at, and I'd love to dive in a little deeper on, is social media. So you mentioned news avoidance before, and I'm curious to know how much of that is avoidance of what we might call traditional news versus sort of, and then replacement with the stuff you get on social media? Or are people consuming more, however you define it, news in general, just not as much from traditional? Or how would you think about how social media fits in here?
It's a good question. I'd have to go back to the Reuters digital news survey where that the news avoidance stuff comes from. My sense is that, and this is a sense, but also from talking to people, who get news from many of our news partners, is that people increasingly are not going to a news source directly, but they're finding news through social media. So something will be shared through Twitter or through Instagram or some other feed. And so you have this incredible new form of power in the world who are these social media aggregators or sense makers or amplifiers, whatever you call them. And they increasingly are between the news organization and the final audience member. And some of them have, millions and millions, tens of millions of followers. They're very powerful. And some of them also focus very specifically on certain issues. It may be race, it may be climate change, it may be mental health, it may be our region, our city or our community. So what we want to do and what we've been doing, because we have a program to deal with what we call the influencers, these are people who are social media influencers, is to help them be able to find social solutions journalism more easily and recognize I like to communicate to my audience. You could be a big Hollywood celebrity like maybe Leonardo DiCaprio, who has, so many followers, and really recognize him as a thoughtful person on climate change, someone who's quite knowledgeable. So, he can repost the latest report that says the crisis is even worse than we thought, which is oftentimes the kinds of things that get reposted, this data on global warming and its effects. The ice melt in the Antarctic is even worse than we thought kind of story. Here's 5 methods that are emerging around the country to accelerate, the move towards away from fossil fuels, or to sequester carbon more effectively, or to protect people who are in coastal areas or what have you. So what we want to do is get more of these people who have this tremendous power in reaching audiences, make it easier for them to find solutions-oriented journalism around the issues that they already care about, and want to be more valuable to their audiences by not just freaking them out all the time about the problems, but also, passing along really useful information that often can be acted upon.
I think that all makes a ton of sense. I wonder also in there if there isn't I think one of the dangers of social media is that it tends to keep pushing you farther and farther into your camp, right? Because it's going to serve you up the stuff you want to hear. So if I'm concerned about climate change and I think we need to do something about it, I might be following Leonardo DiCaprio. If I think this is all BS and I'm still a denier, I'm following, ExxonMobil's Twitter, whatever, and that these things reinforce that. I wonder if part of your work is or will eventually be almost like consumer training as well. One of the things that I have big concerns about social media, but one of the things that frustrates me is I feel like a lot of us behave as if we're just helpless. Oh, these guys are just feeding me all this stuff. It's like, well, you could turn it off. You could stop following that person who's upsetting you so much. I wonder if there's a train the consumer or something to try to break that down a little bit. It's an awfully daunting task, but I just throw it out there.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to do. There are organizations like the News Literacy Project, which does very good work training young people in how to be sort of more critical and more sort of mindful consumers of news. I think that is very, very important. I mean, especially around social media, especially when we're seeing so many young people, especially young girls, who are really suffering emotionally and mentally in terms of mental health because of social media. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has written a lot about this. So that's a big part of it. I think that there's a natural tendency for people to want to evolve from feeling out of control to feeling in control. I think that we're wired to seek control around. One of the sort of paradoxes of disinformation or misinformation is that paradoxically it gives us a sense of control, even if the sense of control is this idea that it's a global conspiracy to do whatever. It's a way of making sense of things that is a kind of, so in some ways it is speaking to people's sense of powerlessness. So I would say that's not a healthy way to speak to people's powerlessness. If you can actually speak to their powerlessness by actually giving them really useful things that help them to take the reins on the problems that they're suffering from, this can always be done more effectively at the local level than at the global level. So the closer you can get to the source, the more a local news organization or a person who is speaking through social media is speaking to people who are with some proximity, the more precise they can get in terms of dealing with, the actual issues in that community. When we go around the United States, for example, talking to news organizations, we'll ask them, what are the most important issues in your community that your community is suffering from? And, they will know, and they can say, we're, most of the people in this community, we've heard this a lot, are really worried about the future of our town. We don't know if, we're going to have any young people here 10 years from now, because everyone leaves when they graduate from high school, and it's lonely. And the people in the town feel that they're resentful, that sometimes that their town is portrayed as not a beautiful place to live anymore or whatever. So you can really speak to that. You can say there are towns that have really, come back from being on the brink of that and have really revived themselves and have created new excitement. Things I would say the mental health issue is really, really profound right now because it's so personal and it affects every demographic. It doesn't matter if you're living on the Upper East Side of New York and you're rich and a banker or something like that, or you're poor, or you're from a community of color. Your kids are dealing more. Everyone is dealing with it, but the early onset is very strong. So I would say that any news organization that really does and says, we're going to really help deal with these mental health challenges for our community, we're going to look for good ideas, we're going to talk about them, that's really going to be in the direction that we're talking about.
And I think the emphasis on local news is really important because I believe that, I know in other cases, and I think it applies to journalism as well, that trust is a huge issue just in our society. We don't have as much trust in government and our religious institutions. We don't trust election results. But when you do surveys, often people or dislike, they'll say, "What do you think about Congress? They're terrible. What about your congressperson? They're great." Or I hate the media, but my local paper's great. the more you get your proximity, people are mean, but my neighborhood, they're lovely, right? So I think the more you can stoke those local outlets, the more trust and the more, I don't know. Have you sensed that? Is that something that comes out in your work as well?
100%. You're 100% right. And I think it's the most important insight in terms of trust right now is the idea that, we tend to think in the news business, there's this idea that people trust us because we're accurate.
Yeah.
And here's the fact check.
Yeah.
Little logo or something like that. People don't trust, we evolved, human beings evolved in a relational context. We trust people who we believe have our backs.
Right.
We trust people, there's a phrase that someone once said to me, I don't care what you know. I don't care what you know until I know that you care. Right? I trust you to the degree that I think that you care about me. And I think that is really core. News organizations, if they want to rebuild trust, and this is the same for government agencies, they need to show people we care about you. We really do care about you. It's very hard if you're a news organization to show people we care about you if all you're doing all the time is telling people how terrible their town is.
Yeah.
That
That's
doesn't
true.
make me feel like you care about me. That tells me that you don't care about my mental health at all. And you certainly haven't done your homework to know what's important to me. But if you say we've done our homework to know what's important to you, we actually asked our community, what are our most priority areas? And now as a news organization, we're going to help us find ideas to solve those problems. And we're going to hold our elected officials accountable based on our priorities, not based on what they feel like talking about on the stump speech. If you do that, and you do that regularly, trust will go up. I mean, we have seen news organizations who've seen that. It's the weird thing about all this, Bill, is that it's so common sense.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, just be decent.
Right.
If people say we're suffering from this, don't, I remember reading somewhere that most people who sue doctors for medical malpractice don't do it because they got a bad outcome. They do it because they feel that the doctor didn't listen and completely disregarded what they said.
I have firsthand information on that. We used to be on the board of a hospital, and we were debating that our malpractice policy. And historically, what hospitals would do, something awful happens, and everyone goes in their camps. The doctors and the hospital lawyer up on this side, the patient and the family lawyers up on this side, and all you have is conflict. The movement now is the minute there's a mistake, the physicians want to own it. They don't want to do this. The patients and the families just want someone to tell them the truth. And as hospitals do this, they're finding their overall litigation costs have gone down. The morale of the physician goes up because they feel better. The family just wanted someone to look them in the eye and tell them the truth. They weren't out to bankrupt the hospital. It absolutely works. And it seems there's a transactional relationship in journalism that's different, but similar.
Very much. I think that the news field could really learn from that.
Yeah.
And the humility that's baked into that.
Right.
I mean, the humility.
The research that's been done on people's receptivity to solutions journalism clearly makes the case that even if you look at it only from a business perspective, it's worth doing. I remember reading that story on homelessness in Houston, and I continue to see reports on the work being done in that city. And the importance of local journalism cannot be overstated. For a properly functioning democracy, people need to know what's going on, not just globally or nationally, but also in their own community. And the fact that local sources can more effectively establish trust really supports the notion that local outlets can really benefit by taking a solutions approach and helping their consumers improve the communities in which they work and live. To kick off the final segment of this Blue Sky conversation, I asked David what people in the Blue Sky listening audience, that's you, can do to support the work of his organization.
We are a nonprofit organization, so we're a 501c3. So, if people want to donate financially, that's always welcome and wonderful. The main thing right now, in addition to that kind of support is, as you were saying, we need more people out there in the world who are telling news organizations, we want you to cook better food, basically. We want the journalism to be not exclusively, but to have a very strong solutions component in addition to the traditional, watchdog function. So people can actually be speaking. We said that this is very powerful at the local level. You can actually be in communication with your news source and let them know that we want you to shift it. We're going to communicate back to you what is the solutions journalism approach to this story for our community. And you can be in communication. That will push the needle on what you get. If you are active on social media and you are particularly interested in any issue, whether it's the ones we talked about, let's say it's the climate crisis, you can become a communicator of potential ideas to your friends and to your audiences. You might have a feed, you might have a few thousand followers or many more. You can definitely use solutions journalism as part of your feed to help people have conversations around possibilities and not just create more eco-anxiety, which is what a lot of those feeds do. If you're running a company, there's lots and lots of ideas that you can have conversation groups, with your employees about, we have a solution story tracker, I said, with 15,000 stories. You could look at the story tracker and search on any particular issue and discuss not just the day's horrible headlines, but let's have a conversation today about some of the things that are happening in our society that are helping, around some of our core issues. You can also do it as a parent. Many young people are really, really upset about the world. I was just talking to a friend whose daughter is really depressed about the world because goes on, reads the headlines. You're almost gutted by the time you've gotten through the front page. And so you can look at the news, like what I say with our solution story tracker, you can go there and read many stories that show you these are the ways that people are trying to build a better world. And some of these things are very successful. And so I would say to parents, if you find you're having conversation with your kids and there's a lot of negativity, say that's only half the story. There's another half of the story. And go pull up some of these articles and discuss them at the dinner table or whenever you do, so that people don't only consume the news, which is extremely biased towards the most threatening information in the world, but they also see the other half. And so you can do this with friends, you can do this on college campuses. And increasingly for people, I think, if I were a young person today, I've been in journalism now for more than 30 years, but starting out today, there's extraordinary opportunities in being a communicator. You can set up shop and have quite a big impact very quickly. I mean, look at yourself. You create a podcast and suddenly you're reaching lots of people. So become an expert in something that really matters and load up your head with lots of ideas about possibilities, not just the ability to criticize what is. We know what's wrong with the world. It's important to be aware of the urgency, but we also need to know what our options and our possibilities are. Load up your mind with lots and lots of ideas about possibilities that are emerging, and then be yourself a spreader of agency. Because that's really how the world's going to change. The more people who are powerful and have good ideas and act upon them, that's the only way we're going to get through this.
And that's one of the big pluses of social media, frankly, is that it can multiply things. Ideas can get multiplied in good ways and bad ways, but let's focus on good ways very quickly in ways you could never have imagined 15 years ago. So this, then we should wrap up, but this news story bank, is that publicly accessible? You have this long list of, how would I find that?
Just go to Solution Story Tracker. Just Google
Solution Story Tracker.
Story Tracker. Yeah. Go to our website, solutionsjournalism.org. You can click to it. Or if you just Google the Solution Story Tracker, it's freely available. You set up an account, it takes about a minute, and then you can search, and we keep on adding to it. And then once you're in it, you can see the journalists and the news sources, and you can go further down that and see what are the other things. And increasingly, hopefully soon, we're trying to develop an AI classifier where you'll be able to go into any news source and be able to look at the news through the lens of what are the problem-solving ideas around homelessness, around mental health. That's going to take a while, but we're hoping that becomes something that makes it easy to search the news automatically to find solutions journalism and be able to say things like, I'm looking for solution stories in Africa around agriculture or around urban development. and be able to get a bunch of stories that help you see what's the adaptive resilience in our societies, not just the corrosive or malfeasance, not just the corrosive actions or the malfeasance.
Well, David Bornstein at Solutions Journalism Network, thank you so much for your time today, and even more so for this incredible work. We've talked so much on this show about the deleterious effects of media, and it's really inspiring to hear someone focus on solutions. I think you're onto something very big and very important, and I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, Bill. It's really a pleasure.
I'm glad we were able to talk about how people can help, and that this included the idea that we as consumers are not helpless. News outlets need us, and they'll listen when we speak up. And it's great that the Solutions Journalism Network shares this database of stories, and it would do us all a lot of good if we check some of these out and share them with our friends and family. And I hope you noticed that David had me feeling so good by the end of this episode that I even managed to say some positive things about social media. Yes, the power of hope and optimism is indeed contagious. I really enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with David Bornstein, and I hope you did too. To be sure you don't miss any of our future episodes, please consider subscribing to this podcast and following the Optimism Institute on social media. And please do give us any and all feedback. How you think we're doing, subjects you'd like us to cover, or guests we should try to feature. We really do want to hear from you. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke. And I thank you for listening.